So one thing you'll see as we work through all of our different retouches is just how important color grading is to achieving a really nice look in your images. So you can get to a really nice look in a fairly small amount of time. And, color grading is a very personal thing. Everybody has their own style, their own preferences. And so don't kind of take what I'm doing here as the be-all and end-all formula. We're going to work through a couple of different tools for doing color grading as we look at the different images. But ultimately, you have to apply your own style and your own eye to it and just, do whatever looks good to you. In the case of test images, we don't want to get too carried away with color grading. We want to keep it looking natural because ultimately that is the purpose of a test look, is we want it to look natural. We don't want it to look like an editorial or something extremely stylized. We want the model to look like herself and look like it's been barely edited. So what I like to do for color grading is I usually create a group, and I'm just going to call it grading or color or whatever you like to do. And we're going to start applying our color grading adjustment layers into there. Now you can use something like AlienSkin or RadLab to do your color grading. That's fine. Again, keep it to something that's fairly light. Or you can just create a set of actions for yourself. So whatever you find that typically works, you can record that as an action and just play that back for your test looks. But I'll just kind of show you what I would maybe do to this particular image here. So I'll usually start off with something like a black and white adjustment layer and just see whether or not that helps to build some contrast in our image. Because again, I just want to extract a little bit more depth out of this image. So we're not actually going to keep it in black and white, even though it is right now. We're going to change our blend mode to something like multiply. And what multiply is going to do is it's going to darken our image. And as you can see, now we've got like a super dark and moody image, which we don't really want. We want it, again, looking a little bit more natural. But we can adjust opacities and we can play with a lot of things to make it look good. So we're going to drop this opacity way, way down to something like maybe 15%. And we can see the effect that that has. Now what I want to do is I want to actually add contrast, and because the whole image is getting darkened, we're not really changing contrast, we're just changing overall luminosity of the image. So we're going to double click on this, and it's going to open up this layer styles panel. So in this layer styles, we can adjust using these blend if sliders what area of luminosity is affected by this particular adjustment. So if I start sliding this way, you'll see that anything that has a lightness value between here and here, it's not getting that adjustment applied. So we can see, we got this like sharp line going through here. Not looking great, but we're going to make it look good. Similarly, on the highlight end, if we kind of cut this off, you can see that it is cutting it off from certain parts of the highlight values. So we're going to use this, but we're going to use it in a different way. So I'm just going to slide this over until we see that it starts to bring out the, or it doesn't apply to the highlights of the skin. So let's kind of shift over. And now we can see at this point here, these highlights are not getting this particular adjustment layer applied to them, essentially. Now, this obviously looks terrible, so what we're going to do to refine this is we're going to hold down the Alt or Option key, we're going to split these sliders here, and we're going to separate it out. So as we kind of separate this out, what we're doing is we're basically feathering that application. So, between this range, so here, from this end to here, we're getting 0% application of this adjustment layer. Between here and here, we're gradually increasing towards 100%. So from here to the left, and basically between these two tabs, is 100% being applied. From here to here, it's going from 100 down to 0. So this is kind of our feather area. So that's going to work fine, I think. We're going to click OK there. I'm actually going to lower the opacity even a little bit more than that because I still think it's too much for a test look. So maybe something like 13%, maybe even less than that. Let's try 11. Yeah, that should be good. So that's giving us a little bit of contrast, which I like. Now what we can do is start playing with the colors a little bit. Now again, we want to keep the colors fairly simple. So I'm just going to use what I think is the best color grading tool out there, which is a selective color. And we're going to actually create a couple of layers of this, but you can see how useful this tool really is because it allows you to do almost everything from a luminosity or color standpoint within one interface. So if, for example, we want to work on shadow tones, we can just go into here and select blacks. And so from blacks, we can adjust how much of a particular color is in the blacks. So if we slide yellow up, we're going to add more yellow to the blacks. If we slide it to the left, then it's going to add more blue. So essentially, these are all offsetting colors. And the best way to remember it is if we have CMYK here, the opposite is RGB. So cyan red, magenta is green, and yellow is blue. So CMYK, RGB. So going to the left, we're going to add blue. So as you can see, if I push it this way, you basically get a lot of blue in your shadows, which can be a nice look for an editorial. Like something like this is very popular. But again, we want to keep this to a minimum in a test look. So I'm going to do this, but I'm going to just do it very subtly. So maybe we'll go -2 on our blacks. What I also like to do, oftentimes I find that there is some green in the shadows, especially with brunettes in their hair. I find that we get a little bit of a green cast. So I like to nudge magenta up a little bit. And you can see it now, like from here to here, just how much more pleasing the tone is if we just go up by about 1. So let me just get this up here at 1. There we go. And just toggling that on and off, it's really subtle, but it's taking away a little bit of that green tinge in there. And then with cyans, again, if you want to, for example, create a look that's a little bit more vintage, we can start playing with this kind of stuff. But again, I would maybe nudge this to something like +1. And I think that looks pretty good. And if you find that it's a little too intense, and I still think personally this is, minor changes in these sliders when you're in blacks or whites make a pretty big difference. So in this case, we're just going +1 on these two, -1 here. And if that's still too intense, we can obviously lower the opacity as well. So I'm just going to name this one blacks. And then we're going to create another selective color adjustment, and I'm going to focus on whites. So we're going to go into whites, and this is going to work on our highlights. The reason I didn't do them together is because sometimes I want to change the opacity of the respective options here, and I decided, you know what, the blacks are maybe too stylized. I can go down on that without affecting my whites at the same time. So I can just basically independently control those values. Now with this, as you can see here, as we start pushing cyans, you start to get these cyan highlights, which again can be a really nice color grading option. We don't want to go this far when it comes to a test look, but maybe we want to add a little bit of it. So as we can see here, you can definitely go much farther with whites and it doesn't look too crazy. So we're going to add a little bit of cyan to this. Magenta, for example, we can add a little bit of green if we go this way. So maybe I'll find sort of a middle ground where I add a little bit of green and then let's ease cyan back. And then we can do the same thing with yellow. So you can warm up the highlights with yellows or you can cool the highlights down. So I'm actually going to keep maybe just a little bit of warm. So I'm just going to put +3 or so into our highlights here. Sometimes it's really difficult to do using the slider. It's just easier to type it in. There we go. So, if that, again, let's just toggle this on and off. You can see that that just stylizes it a little bit, but it's not too crazy. If it's too much, again, we just lower down our opacity and find a happy medium. Now we're going to go in and work on the skin tones. Again, using selective color, we're going to go into our reds. And obviously skin tones predominantly red or yellow. Now, generally, they're more orange, so you find yourself somewhere in between red and yellow. So we'll actually work on both. So we'll work on reds and yellows here in this one adjustment layer. So let's just see what happens when we push cyan. So basically, when we push this, we're taking away red, right? Because cyan is the opposite of red. So if we find that the red is a little too intense, which I think it is in this particular image, I'm just going to nudge it a little bit this way, and that's going to inject a little bit more cyan in there. Magenta is going to add more green, so if we take away magenta, we're just going to add more green into the skin tone. And I'm going to actually take away a tiny bit of magenta, maybe go -2 here. Let's see. You know what? I think I'm going to leave magenta alone. I think it looks better actually just as it is. And then yellow, we'll take away yellow from the skin tone and add blue. So obviously something like this, not a good look. Something like this also, not good either. It looks like she's got jaundice or something. So don't push these values too far. In this case, I'm just going to take out a little bit of yellow, maybe go -2 here. Again, just going to type this in for ease. All right, and then let's take a look at yellow. So again, we can push cyans in the yellows. I'm going to maybe add a tiny bit here. I'm okay with the magenta. I don't think I'm going to do anything there. And as far as yellow in the yellow goes, again, I'm going to leave that too. Now, by the way, if you change blacks, what it's basically doing is if I take black down, it's going to add more sort of white to the yellow, so they're going to become lighter and lighter. And if I go this way, it's going to darken yellows. So you can kind of adjust luminosity here. I don't recommend that you adjust luminosity using the black slider. Quality is not as good as it is with curves or levels or something along those lines. So, don't do it too much here. You can go like -2, +2, but don't push it far beyond that. So we're going to leave that as is, and let's just take a look at how that one's going. So we really just, it's a super subtle adjustment, just taking out a little bit of that redness from the skin tone. So I'm just going to rename this one Skin. And we're going to name this one Whites, just so we stay organized here. So that basically there is, as you can see, just giving us a light color grading, nothing too crazy, but it's definitely looking a lot better. Now, if we want to add any more contrast to it, what we can do is add another black and white adjustment layer. So let's go back into here. Where are we? Black and white. And this one, we're going to add some highlights. So we're going to go into screen blend mode instead of multiply this time, which will lighten the entire image. And we're going to, again, use our blend if options, but we're going to cut it off from the shadow end. Before we cut off the highlights, now we're going to cut off some of the shadows. So again, we're going to split here and do something like that. There we go. Now, obviously, this is way too intense, so we're going to drop the opacity way down to something like maybe 12% opacity. As you can see there, that's just punching up the highlights a little bit, and you can decide how much of that you want. You can mask out certain areas, but I think that's about as far as I would go for a test look. So that essentially is our test edit. You don't want to do too much more than that. We're going to look at a bunch of different color grading tools as we work through different examples, but really, it's all about keeping it simple, keeping it looking natural. And if we look at a before and after here, this is where we started, this is where we ended off, and it was all really about just minor refinements, matching up some tones, applying some color grading, building in a little bit of depth and contrast, and then getting to this final result. So what we're going to do next is we're going to crop this image and we're going to prepare it for sending off to an agency.